A reading from Mark chapter 9, verses 2 through 9. You can find this reading on page 919 in the Pew Bible. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. The Gospel of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Apollo 13 Commander Jim Lovell has more time and space, almost 24 days already, than any other man. And I asked him recently if he ever was scared.
Oh, well, I've had an engine flame out a few times in an aircraft and was kind of curious as to whether it was going to light up again, things of that nature. But they seem to work out.
Is there a specific instance in an airplane emergency when you can recall fear?
Well, I tell you, I remember this one time, I'm in a Banshee at night in combat conditions, so there's no running lights on the carrier. It was the Shangri-La, and we were in the Sea of Japan, and my radar had jammed, and my homing signal was gone because somebody in Japan was actually using the same frequency, and so it was leading me away from where I was supposed to be. And I'm looking down at a big black ocean, so I flip on my map light, and then suddenly, zap, everything shorts out right there in my cockpit. All my instruments are gone, my lights are gone, and I can't even tell now what my altitude is. I know I'm running out of fuel, so I'm thinking about ditching in the ocean, and I look down there, and then in the darkness, there's this green trail. It's like a long carpet that's just laid out right beneath me, and it was the algae, right? It was that phosphorescent stuff that gets churned up in the wake of a big ship, and it was just leading me home. And now, if my cockpit lights hadn't shorted out, there's no way I'd have ever been able to see that. So, you never know what events are going to transpire to get you home.
Good movie. It's a good clip. I mean, it's an incredible image to me to think that you're out in the middle of nowhere over an ocean. It's pitch black, and then there's this, these living things, this algae that gets churned up and just has enough glow to it to almost be a road leading you to where you need to go. It's a great image, and I started thinking about that image on this particular day of things that are glowing, and I went ahead and Googled things that glow, and I found this interesting. It's not so much a story, but a history piece that some of you might have heard of. It was completely new to me. It was about miners. Miners, roughly 100 years ago, maybe give or take, a few years, but 100 years ago or so, before electricity was run down into mines, so maybe even longer than that, the reality that in a mine that's however many hundreds of feet below the surface in solid rock, that there's absolutely no light, right? I mean, we probably can't imagine how pitch dark it really is in the depths of a mine like that. And so the question has to come up, how in the world would they be able to see? Now, when you're mining, keep in mind, this is one of the most lethal professions, if you will, jobs at the time. I think it still is pretty far up the list. And the reason for that is, the things caving in, stuff that you breathe in, but it's also due to explosions, because sometimes there are gases that are let out when you're mining, but it's also, if it's coal mining, there's also coal dust. And so if you want to use a candle, or if you were to use anything that might be combustible in any way, there were lots of explosions. And so there's no way to see, because you can't bring that kind of light down there. So the question is, how in the world did you do mining? How in the world did you see anything? And that is what led me to a couple of articles, and I got this from a few sources because I thought it was more of a joke than anything, and it turned out that it was fairly common that miners had a choice. And one of those choices was to really work in pretty much pitch black. By field, go to the end, pitch black, and you tried to do mining that way. The other option was, and I found this hard to believe, which is why I found it in a few sources, is that they would haul piles of fish. And they would pile them up, and when the fish would decompose, it would let off a faint glow. A little bit of a glow so they could see. Now, it wouldn't be much of a glow that we would see in a dark room around here, but in the pitch black of beneath the earth, it was plenty of light for them to do their work. But the trade-off in that choice was, of course, you can either work in darkness and have relatively fresh air, or you can get a little bit of light and smell that your entire day of 10, 12, whatever hours of mining. But things that glow. And I had my preconceived notions of how many things that glow without electricity or technology of any kind. And so as I was searching for this, I found this history, which I thought was interesting, that decomposing fish would glow. And, oh, by the way, they would also find that if they cleaned the fish and just used the skins, those would glow a little bit less than the entire fish, but the skins themselves would also have this glow to them. So it was pretty interesting. But there are other things that glow. Next slide, please. This is a picture that is not enhanced of plankton, like I don't know what they call it, but a whole group of plankton that washes ashore, and it has a glow to it. I don't know what you call it. Keith has probably got a word for me. What would you call it? A bucket, a group? I don't know, a pod? I don't know what you call it. But it's a whole bunch of plankton that as it washed again on the shore, it got churned up, kind of like what Jim Lovell was talking about in that movie clip, and it glows. It has a blue glow to it. I thought that this is not an altered picture at all. Now, I saw lots of these kinds of things. This is the one that is just the clearest on the beach. I thought it was interesting, right? It glows. Next slide, please. This is a cave. And you can see on the top of the cave, again, an unaltered picture, are glowworms in this particular case. Not all caves have that, but you can see these living creatures giving off a bit of a light. Next slide, please. I knew about these. There are certain jellyfish or jellies that in the deep parts of the ocean that have their own glow to them, casting off a little bit of light. Next slide, please. And fungus, mushrooms in this case. I saw some pictures, again, unaltered pictures of fungus growing in forest areas. It looked a lot more like the movie Avatar than what I would expect from a real picture. But it was a real picture. Just things were glowing everywhere. And I was surprised when I Googled this to find so many different living organisms that emit their own light. There was way more than I could have thought. We could go on and on and on with all of the different life forms that I found. But that's kind of the point for today, right? A living being glowing, emitting light. It's exactly what this text is talking about. It's a weird text. It's a strange text. And I'll admit to you that if I didn't promise 2 weeks ago that I would preach the lectionary for a couple of weeks before we get into a series for Lent, I probably would avoid this text because today is Transfiguration Sunday. And that means that this is the text that we're supposed to read from, but it's a text that is completely out there, odd, and strange. It's a text where, to be completely blunt, Jesus glows. He lights up. The text says a dazzling white, and there's no way to get around it. As you know, as you get to know me, I like to dig into a word and say, well, maybe this word really means something else. There's no way around it. In the text, it's very clear, Jesus glows. Jesus lights up. Jesus illuminates. And so it's a weird text. Next slide, please. The text, in short, is this, just to give you the Cliff's Notes version. So what we have in this very odd, strange, weird text is Jesus goes up to a mountain. Okay? He goes up to a mountain. And then when he's at the top of the mountain, the second verse is, he lights up. He glows. He becomes radiant. And then, and the text says dazzling white. And then after that, then Elijah and Moses show up. Elijah and Moses, who have been dead for hundreds of years, by the way. Hundreds of years. And they just show up next to him. And then his disciples say, you know what? There's extra people here. There's a lot of light. Can I build you guys a house? We'll build some dwellings, some tabernacles is what it says. We're going to build you tents so you guys have a place to stay. And then a dark cloud comes over, and the voice of God, it doesn't really say the voice of God, but a voice comes from the cloud and says, "This is my son, my beloved." And then everyone disappears. That's it. That's all I get to work with today. That's all I'm supposed to, from that, glean some sort of truth. But the reality is, when I read this story, there's only one other image that comes to mind for me. And some of you will know what this is. Next slide. Right? Right? A couple other figures that just show up from the dead and start glowing. But seriously, that's what I imagine. It can't quite comprehend this scene of Jesus and two other people showing up, glowing. But that's the text that we're handed today. And so there are just a couple of pieces that do jump out at me, and then those 2 or 3 pieces took me on a serious turn today that I really couldn't avoid in my own heart. And so here are some of the pieces that I want to lift up. Next slide, please. The first is the word stilbo. I already mentioned this a little bit. It's the word glow, radiate, illuminate. The reality is I can't get around this word, as I already mentioned. There is no other option. It simply means something lights up. So Jesus stilbo, Jesus lights up, Jesus illuminates. What's interesting, though, is how different gospel writers talk about this word, talk about the reason why. So next slide, please. The gospel, according to Luke's gospel, says that this light, this stilbo, is due to God's glory. I don't necessarily know what that means, and we don't have time to fully unpack that, but it's about God's glory, whatever that is. And what I found most interesting, given that today is the day after Thanksgiving, is that Matthew and Mark both attributed the stilbo, the glow of Jesus, the radiance of Jesus, to love. Because this is when God says, "This is Jesus, my beloved." It has something to do with the relationship of love, God loving his Son. And that has something to do with the glow of Jesus. And that is kind of where my mind went. Next slide, please. The other word that I want to lift up is this word. It's metamorpho. It's the word metamorphosis comes from this word. It's where we get the title for this day, Transfiguration Sunday. But it has more to do with changing. The metamorphosis has more to do with transforming. That there is a change that takes place. That we have this word glowing. We've got the reality of love in the picture. And there is something that changes. And so when I put all these together, I wonder if this is about the transformational power. Putting all that together, the transformational power that the love of God brings to us in the world. I mean, when God showers his love on Jesus and in turn on us, it's not that we just light up and radiate, but something changes, something metamorphosizes, something transforms in us and in the world because of God's love. So what is this love? What do we learn about this kind of love, this Christian kind of love? I had a professor in seminary whose least favorite song was "They Will Know We Are Christians by Our Love." Hated it. Hated it, hated it, hated it. Why? Because there are all kinds of other people that love just as well as Christians do. And so he said, Christians don't have a monopoly on love. And then he would continue and say, unless we take it seriously. Because it's one thing to love our family members. It's one thing to send chocolate and roses to those who we love on Valentine's Day. It's another thing to love the way Jesus teaches us to love. So how does Jesus teach us to love? Next slide. Again, we could say love your neighbors, but everybody says that. That is not unique to Jesus. What's unique to Jesus is Matthew chapter 5, verse 44 and following, which says this. Jesus says this, "But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun shine on the evil and on the good. He sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." And then the Gospel of Luke says something similar in chapter 6. Jesus says, "But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those that hate you." Can't tell you the number of emails and phone calls I've been getting over the past month or two about ISIS. What are we supposed to do, Pastor? People ask. We're supposed to be Christians. And yet, there's an awful lot of this evil and things like that going on in the world. What am I supposed to do? And in this week, there is Kayla Mueller, I think is what her name was. And I don't know how recent the story is. It looked like it just came out this morning. I saw it on one of the news feeds that I get, that they were throwing from off of the top of very high buildings homosexual men and stoning them. These are our enemies in our world. And Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for them. See, loving your neighbor isn't transformative. There's no metamorphosis that comes from loving your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your family. There's nothing that transfigures or transforms anything in that. But if you want to light up the world, love your enemy. Next slide. This kind of love is called agape. Probably heard the word before. It's unconditional. No boundaries, no borders. There's nothing that gets in the way of this kind of love. And this is the kind of love that Jesus and God talk about through all of Scriptures. It's this unconditional love. Now, I don't mean to make a political statement at all. I don't mean to make a military statement at all, but I do mean and intend to make a spiritual one. And it's a spiritual comment, statement, reality that we are called as Christians to love our enemy. I don't know what that looks like in all those other realms. I'm not an expert in politics and military and foreign affairs. But at the very least, as Jesus says, we should be praying for our enemies. I don't know about you, but there haven't been many days that I've lifted up ISIS in my prayers. There haven't been many days where I've lifted up those people who have actually done the beheadings in other places around the world in my prayers. I don't do that very much. I wonder how much that would change the world. Next slide. A member of our congregation wrote this, and I thought these words that I highlighted are so important for today's text. Transfiguration Sunday. Love becomes a reality in the midst of human life only when we embody it, when we share it, and when we live it. It is then that the transformative power of love becomes visible for all to do. How does love become visible? It's when we embrace that agape love, that radical love. You want to change the world. You want to see metamorphosis in the world. You want to see the world change. Maybe we should do what Jesus says and actually love our enemy. It's probably nothing harder we could do. Let us pray. Creator God, we thank you. I thank you for who you are. A God that showers upon us unconditional love and grace. I ask for your strength. I ask for courage to do those things that you call me to do, specifically to love my enemy. I can pretty much promise you, Lord, that I'm not strong enough to do that day in and day out. I may not even be strong enough to do it once. But today, in light of a message of transformation, a message of love, a message of transfiguration and metamorphosis, I ask, that you give us all courage to not just pray for those who make sense to pray for in our lives, those who we actually don't want to pray for at all. I ask for the courage and the strength to pray for my enemy, ISIS, and all of those around the world who hate me. I lift them up to you in prayer. In your name we pray. Amen.